Is your nonprofit full of drama mamas and daddies, or are you good at keeping the peace? Welcome to the Nonprofit Pod. I'm Melissa, a university business professor who specializes in nonprofits. In this episode, we're going to dive into a topic every nonprofit leader will face at some point, even if you are a traditional peacemaker, and that is conflict resolution. Conflict can feel like a challenge and make you want to pull your hair out and also quit nonprofits. But when managed well, it can actually be a good thing. So let's explore some of the common types of conflict in nonprofits, talk about effective resolution approaches, and I'll give you some practical tips you can use to handle conflicts constructively. First, let's talk about types of conflict that tends to arise in nonprofits. Conflict arises naturally when you've got a diverse group of people working together, especially in mission-driven organizations where people are super passionate. And in nonprofits, you also have another layer of complexity where you've got hundreds of other people involved, and those are volunteers. And to make matters even more complex, these volunteers are not paid. So you don't approach conflict resolution sometimes in exactly the same way you would when it's occurring with paid staff, for instance. Here are 3 common types of conflict specific to nonprofits. One are internal staff conflicts, and boy oh boy, I see this all the time when I worked in this sector. When you work in a nonprofit, everyone does get really close because you almost trauma bond over a lot of the challenges of the sector. You're working long nights and hours and weekends, hosting events and sometimes traveling together, but you also sometimes can fight like family. So these internal staff conflicts can occur due to a number of things: stress from the job, personality difference, work style clashes, disagreements over priorities, disagreements over fundraising and donors and who owns a donor. Just for one example, a program director might push for community outreach because their job is community outreach, whereas your finance manager is going to kind of argue on that because they prioritize budget efficiency, and they're going to challenge what the outcomes and scope of this new program is. So these conflicts are natural and they happen in pretty much every single organization, nonprofit or for-profit. Now, something kind of distinct and unique to nonprofits are those staff-volunteer disagreements. Now, volunteers are the lifeblood of nonprofits, of course. They bring invaluable support, but the differing expectations we sometimes have between volunteers and staff and different personalities and types of communication can lead to friction. Staff can sometimes get frustrated with volunteers because volunteers can kind of come and go as they please. Staff don't have that luxury, and staff sometimes depend on volunteers, and when volunteers don't follow through, that can be a source of contention. And staff might perceive that these volunteers lack commitment and they're not trustworthy. On the other hand, volunteers might sometimes feel undervalued. So all of these are natural feelings that can lead to staff-volunteer conflicts. And a lot of times there's a huge power struggle, especially if you have volunteers that are really high-ranking in the corporate world and they come in and feel like they should automatically have authority over, say, an entry-level staff member just because of their experience and their position in the corporate sector. All of these things are pretty common, so if they happen at your nonprofit, you're not alone. A big one is conflicts with stakeholders. This is really tough, especially for nonprofit leaders like executive directors. You've got to juggle a lot of things. You're balancing the demands of board members, funders, community stakeholders, staff, volunteers, all of this. And sometimes they have conflicting needs, wants, and desires. And so balancing all that can be really difficult. For instance, donors might advocate for specific programs, their pet projects that they really love, while community voices push for different priorities. And it's difficult because you're dependent on those donors for their money and their donations. So finding a way how to balance those things and keep everybody at least somewhat happy is a real challenge of nonprofit leadership. Now, believe it or not all conflict is a bad thing. In fact, it can be positive. Constructive conflict is essential for fostering diverse perspectives and avoiding what we call groupthink. High-performing teams in nonprofits actually embrace disagreement and use it as a chance to refine ideas, improve outcomes, and align more deeply with the mission. When you're successful in establishing a culture where your team feels safe to voice differing opinions, you're going to have a lot of success because your team is going to feel much more engaged and innovative. So these differences and these conflicts can actually be catalysts to innovation. While not all conflict is bad, when conflict occurs, sometimes it needs resolution. And different situations call for different strategies. Here are 5 primary conflict resolution styles, and I'll give you examples of how they apply to nonprofits. One is competing. If you have a competing conflict resolution style, you tend to be assertive but uncooperative. Now, regardless of what a kumbaya peacemaker you are, sometimes you need a competing mindset in conflict resolution. And I'll give you an example. If you're in a scenario where you need to make a quick decision, it's an urgent situation, like there is an event coming up that's outdoors and the weather forecast is calling for a tornado, you might need to decide to cancel that event without any type of discussion with other stakeholders or any lengthy discussions. You have to make a decision and roll with it. Another approach is avoiding. Avoiding is where you're unassertive and uncooperative. This is useful when you have a minor conflict that's likely to resolve on its own, like a minor squabble that volunteers might be having over a scheduling disagreement or something like that. Collaborating style is where you are assertive, but you're cooperative. And with collaborating, you're aiming for a win-win solution. And an example in a nonprofit might be when you're trying to align program goals with funding constraints and you're able to make both parties happy. Accommodating. The accommodating style is where you're cooperative, but you're unassertive. And this is great when you just need to keep the peace. Like a volunteer needs some requests for flexibility. Instead of coming in person to do something, they ask to do it remotely. You know, it doesn't really matter. You just need to keep the volunteer happy. So you're cooperative and unassertive and you just agree to it. And finally, compromising. Compromising might sound a little bit like we talked about with cooperating, but it's a little bit different. With this, it's about finding that middle ground. And this is great when both sides have valid points, but they both need to give and take a little bit. An example of this might be allocating budget cuts equitably across departments. So when you're doing budgets, you have to trim some of the spending. You're going to each department and negotiating and deciding who's going to get the cuts. Do you do it equitably? So here are some specific examples of conflicts that can occur in nonprofits and how leaders can resolve those. One is a big one. Conflict over resource allocation. I've never seen a nonprofit in the world that is just bursting at the seams with unlimited resources of money, time, and people. It just doesn't happen. So conflict over those resources is a common issue. Now, an example would be a program director and an operations manager. They clash over how to use limited funds. The program director wants to use it for programs. The operations manager wants to use it for better furniture because maybe everyone's desks are falling apart. So you have to figure out how to resolve this difference of opinion. Using a collaborative approach where each end shares their perspective, explores shared goals, does kind of that give and take, that could lead to a balanced solution that benefits both outreach and operations. As we previously discussed, staff and volunteer conflicts also not uncommon in nonprofits. What happens a lot of times, volunteers tend to feel excluded from decision making, and that's just a realistic fact. That does happen. But by accommodating their input, maybe through a planning committee, which hopefully you have, it's very important in nonprofits, that's a way to show appreciation for their contribution and build stronger relationships and help mitigate at least that particular tension point when it comes to staff versus volunteers. And as we discussed, stakeholder priorities. For example here, you might have board members and funders advocating for different programs than what the community wants. A compromising approach can allocate resources to satisfy both groups, maybe not to the full extent that they want, which demonstrates responsiveness and balance. So here are some actionable tips for nonprofit leaders. Remember, not all conflict is bad, so don't just run from it. Don't let it just frustrate you. Look at harnessing the positive out of it. But managing conflict effectively requires being proactive. Here's how you can lead with confidence. One is to establish clear communication channels. This involves things like regular check-ins and structured feedback sessions with staff and volunteers to ensure that everyone feels that their voice is being heard. And if there are miscommunications and misunderstandings, you can find that out early and nip it in the bud before it blows out of proportion. Another is to set conflict resolution protocols. This might include creating guidelines, and I actually had to do this once in a nonprofit where I was executive director. I actually had to create a volunteer contract that I required all lead volunteers or high-level volunteers to sign that said, if you disagree with something or you have a problem with something, here's a healthy process to follow. But what we don't want you to do is to go on Facebook and complain about it and trash the nonprofit and the community. Here's a healthy and productive way to make sure your voice is heard, that you're treated fairly and you're treated equitably, but that you're not tarnishing the mission and you're not tarnishing the cause and the organization. So coming up with conflict resolution protocols is a great tool to have in your toolbox when a volunteer starts acting a fool and you give it to them and say, let me just remind you of our conflict resolution protocol. Here's how we're going to resolve this. And another thing is to train your team. Equip staff and volunteers with the conflict resolution skills they need to be effective conflict resolvers. This includes things like active listening and assertive communication through regular training. You can find a lot of these online. You can do role plays, and dedicating time to training your team to resolving conflict in a healthy way. It's a bit of an investment of time on the front end, but it will definitely pay off on the back end and in the long term. And encourage constructive conflict. Remember, not all conflict is bad. Conflict can be good. But to do this, you have to encourage constructive conflict. To do this, you can normalize debate in meetings. You don't want groupthink. You don't want everyone coming in and rubber stamping everything. You don't want just one loud mouth or one voice being heard. You want to create an environment where you're asking people to share their thoughts and opinions, giving people an opportunity to write down their thoughts and opinions so they don't feel overwhelmed by the majority. And you also normalize and actually encourage healthy, constructive, professional adult debate. And my favorite is focus on the mission. This was always my go-to when I was faced with a conflict situation, which was a regular thing when I led nonprofits. Nonprofits are just breeding grounds for conflict due to the nature of staff, volunteers, and the huge numbers of people involved and the conflicting priorities that come up in nonprofits. But when you focus on the mission, you help recalibrate everyone to remember why you're all there. So when conflict arises, make sure you ground conversations, and do this for yourself too, in the nonprofit's mission. Ask yourself, what course of action here is in the best interest of the mission? Try to remove yourself out of it as a person. Try to remove people and personalities out of it and stay laser focused on the mission. This helps de-escalate tensions, and it helps realign people around what you're there for, your shared goal, which is the mission. So conflict resolution is a critical skill for nonprofit leaders. Embracing and managing conflict effectively, having an understanding of what your general conflict resolution approach is, but then also adapting that approach to each specific situation can help transform those potential roadblocks and drama situations into opportunities for growth and innovation. Constructive conflict strengthens teams, it promotes diverse viewpoints, and it helps drive mission success. If you found this information helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and visit my website at thenonprofitprof.com for tons of additional resources for nonprofits, including free leadership courses, tips, articles, advice, and more. And I'll see you next time.